Everyone has a different answer when asked who the most tragic character in House of the Dragon is. Some will say Rhaenyra because she spends her life fighting for a throne promised to her by her father, only to watch her family torn apart. Others will say Helaena, whose gentle spirit is crushed by unimaginable grief. Many will choose Daemon, a man forever chasing recognition he could never fully earn. And then there is Aemond, whose childhood humiliation transformed him into one of the most feared warriors in Westeros. But there is one character whose tragedy often goes unnoticed because his flaws are so obvious. Aegon Targaryen. Not because he was a hero, not because he was innocent, and certainly not because every decision he made deserves sympathy. Aegon did terrible things. The series never asks us to ignore that, and neither should we. But tragedy isn't measured by innocence. It's measured by wasted potential, by emotional neglect, and by watching someone slowly become the very monster their upbringing created. When you really examine Aegon's life, you begin to realize something heartbreaking. Almost every major decision that defined his life was made by someone else. Long before he ever wore the crown, his fate had already been decided. The first tragedy of Aegon's life happened before he could even understand the world around him. He was born into a family already divided. His father, King Viserys, had publicly declared Rhaenyra his heir. That decision should have settled the succession forever. Instead, it planted the seeds of civil war. From the moment Aegon was born, he wasn't simply the king's son, he became a political symbol. To one side, he represented stability. To the other, he represented a threat. Imagine being born and instantly becoming the center of a conflict you didn't create. Before Aegon ever spoke his first words, thousands of people had already begun imagining him wearing a crown. Not because he wanted one, but because they needed him to. His mother, Alicent Hightower, genuinely loved her son, but her love was constantly poisoned by fear. She believed that if Rhaenyra became queen, Aegon and his siblings would eventually be killed. Whether that fear was justified isn't the point. The important part is that Alicent believed it completely. Children absorb the emotions of their parents. Aegon grew up surrounded by anxiety, surrounded by whispers, surrounded by warnings. He wasn't raised to enjoy life, he was raised to survive it. Every lesson became political. Every family gathering carried hidden tension. Every smile concealed suspicion. That is not a healthy childhood. That is psychological warfare inside your own home. Then there was Otto Hightower. Perhaps no one influenced Aegon's destiny more than his grandfather. Otto rarely viewed people emotionally. He viewed them strategically. To him, Aegon wasn't simply his grandson. He was the strongest claim to the Iron Throne, a living opportunity to preserve House Hightower's influence. Every conversation, every decision, every calculated move eventually pointed toward one outcome: place Aegon on the throne. Whether Aegon wanted it never truly mattered, because kingship wasn't about Aegon's happiness. It was about Otto's vision. And then there was the one person whose approval Aegon desperately needed: King Viserys. Viserys loved all of his children. But love isn't only about what you feel, it's about what you show. Throughout the series, Aegon constantly appears emotionally distant from his father. Viserys devoted enormous attention to Rhaenyra. She was his chosen heir, his greatest remaining connection to Queen Aemma, his political future. Meanwhile, Aegon often seemed like an afterthought. Imagine constantly wondering why your father never looks at you the same way he looks at your older sister. Imagine believing that no matter what you accomplish, you'll never truly matter. That kind of emotional neglect leaves scars no one else can see. People often ask why Aegon became an alcoholic, why he sought pleasure, why he wasted his days drinking, gambling, and escaping responsibility. The answer may be simpler than many think. He was empty. Children who grow up without emotional security often spend adulthood chasing temporary comfort, alcohol, attention, validation, anything that briefly fills the hole. None of it solves the problem, it only delays it. Aegon wasn't running toward happiness, he was running away from pain. One of the saddest scenes in the series happens before his coronation, when Sir Criston Cole and Prince Aemon search King's Landing for Aegon. They don't find a prince eager to rule. They find a young man desperately trying to avoid becoming king. He literally tries to run away. Think about that. Most fantasy stories revolve around characters fighting for crowns. Aegon did the opposite. He wanted freedom. He understood something almost everyone else ignored. He knew he wasn't prepared. He knew he wasn't responsible. He knew the burden would destroy him. When he says he doesn't want the throne, he's probably the most honest person in the room. Unfortunately, honesty means nothing when politics takes over. Then comes one of the most emotionally confusing moments in his life, his coronation. As the crown is placed upon his head, the crowd begins cheering. For perhaps the first time in his life, people are celebrating him. Not because they know him, not because they love him, but because of what he represents. For a brief moment, Aegon smiles. Many viewers interpreted that smile as ambition, but it can also be interpreted as something much sadder. Imagine spending your entire childhood feeling unwanted, only to suddenly hear thousands of strangers cheering your name. Anyone would be overwhelmed. For a few precious seconds, Aegon experiences the acceptance he had spent his whole life searching for. The tragedy is that the love wasn't for Aegon. It was for the crown. Then war begins. The Dance of the Dragons changes everything. Aegon doesn't suddenly transform into a legendary king. Instead, every insecurity he carried into adulthood becomes amplified. Every bad instinct grows worse. Every fear becomes reality. Leadership requires confidence. Aegon inherited doubt. Leadership requires wisdom. Aegon inherited resentment. Leadership requires preparation. Aegon inherited trauma. Then comes perhaps the darkest moment of his entire life, the murder of his young son, Jaehaerys. No matter how you feel about Aegon, no parent deserves that. The cheerful prince who once laughed during his coronation disappears forever. Grief consumes him. His desire for revenge overwhelms reason. The emotional damage is impossible to measure. People often underestimate how much losing a child changes someone. For Aegon, it shattered whatever remained of his humanity. Then came Rook's Rest, one of the most devastating battles in the dance. Desperate to prove himself worthy, Aegon mounts Sunfyre, and what follows changes his life forever. Dragonfire engulfs him. His armor melts into his flesh. His bones are broken. His body is permanently scarred. The once handsome young king becomes almost unrecognizable. Even breathing becomes painful. Even standing becomes difficult. His suffering doesn't last days, it lasts months. Imagine waking every morning trapped inside a body that constantly reminds you of your failure. That becomes Aegon's reality. Yet through all this, Sunfyre never abandons him. The bond between Aegon and Sunfyre is one of the few genuinely beautiful relationships in his story. Sunfyre is often described as the most beautiful dragon in Westeros, golden scales, magnificent wings, a creature worthy of legends. After Rook's Rest, both king and dragon are broken, scarred, wounded, barely surviving. Together they become reflections of each other, two majestic beings reduced to shadows of what they once were. And yet, neither gives up. Their shared suffering makes their bond even stronger. It's one of the few relationships in Aegon's life that asks nothing from him. Sunfyre doesn't care about politics. He doesn't care about succession. He doesn't care about crowns. He simply remains loyal. Sometimes his dragon understood him better than his own family did. One of the greatest ironies in the series is that everyone believed they knew what Aegon should become. Otto wanted a king, Alicent wanted security, Kristen wanted a symbol. The Greens wanted legitimacy, the kingdom wanted stability. But almost nobody stopped to ask, what does Aegon want? The answer had always been obvious. He wanted escape. Not responsibility, not power, not greatness, just escape. And because nobody listened, everyone eventually paid the price. None of this erases Aegon's faults. He abused his power, he mistreated innocent people, he acted selfishly, he often chose cruelty when compassion was possible. Those choices belong to him. Understanding someone is not the same as excusing them. But if tragedy only belonged to good people, it wouldn't be tragedy. The most heartbreaking stories are often about flawed people who never had the chance to become better. Perhaps that is why Aegon resonates with so many viewers. He's painfully human. He isn't a legendary conqueror. He isn't a perfect prince. He isn't a chosen hero. He's an emotionally neglected son, trying to live up to expectations he never asked for. A frightened young man, pretending to be a king. A broken father, trying to survive unbearable grief. A scarred warrior, forced to continue fighting long after he should have been allowed to rest. In the end, Aegon's greatest enemy was never Rhaenyra. It wasn't Daemon. It wasn't even the Blacks. His greatest enemy was the life that had already been written for him before he could write it himself. He inherited fear instead of confidence, manipulation instead of guidance, pressure instead of affection, duty instead of choice. And by the time he finally understood the weight of the crown, it had already crushed him. That is why Aegon Targaryen may be the most tragic character in House of the Dragon. Not because he was the best person, not because he deserved the throne, but because he spent his entire life searching for love, purpose, and acceptance, only to discover that everyone wanted the king. Almost no one truly wanted the man. And perhaps that's the cruelest fate of all.